I'm Dr. Rob McKenna, and welcome to the Wild Conversation, where we make the best thinking in psychology, leadership, and organizational science accessible to leaders who are willing to learn and edit for their sake and for the sake of others. And I'm coming at you from a different location today. It's in a mysterious hidden place that all I can tell you is it might be snowing right now. But today we are continuing our series on what executives are really talking about. And this is something that they talk about. This week's topic is moving from technical expertise to people leadership. And I just want to frame this. It doesn't matter what your technical skill, whether it's accounting, plumbing, law, software, medicine, physical security. Hey, industrial organizational psychology happens to be where my technical skill is. There comes a time when you move from being an expert in that skill to a time when sometimes because of that skill, you start leading people because of that. And it is such a normal transition for people to go through. But there are some common things that occur in that. And today we have a special treat. We have a panel. And more accurately, as you know, sometimes we do things here at Wild. We have a fishbowl of leaders who have experience either moving from technical roles into leadership roles, or maybe the other direction, or even of leading very technical people. And in preparation for this, I asked them to read an article that we just published titled "The 10 Tips for Moving from Technical Expertise to Leadership Expertise," and to answer a couple of questions about it. And it's an article that I wrote as I dug deep back into some of the work I've done over the years, and where we'd studied different populations of people. And it was kind of fascinating to think about some of the things that are a part of this transition that we'll get into. But here are a couple of the questions they were asked. The first one is, what is inspiring or encouraging to you about this article? And you're all going to have access to this article as well. Where does it get you thinking more deeply or affirm something you have already felt or have experienced? And then the second question was something like this. What have you learned from your mission to move leaders from technical expertise to leader expertise, or even maybe the other way? And this would be both their personal lessons regarding their own development or other general lessons. But before they launch, let me give you just a couple of little teasers for the article. There were 10 tips in this, but let me give you a couple of them. Number 5 is technical problems are people problems. That's number 5. Number 7 was the imposter syndrome is not all bad. The imposter syndrome is not all bad. Number 9, productivity will no longer be measured simply by work produced. Interesting. And then number 10, becoming a leader will take time. So let me introduce our fishbowl. Let me introduce our fish for the fishbowl today. And I just am so humbled by these leaders. These are great folks. So today we have Nick Weber, who is, some of you know Nick, who is a managing partner at Archer International, and who is a security leader within government, military, and private sector. He has that experience with a focus on critical infrastructure protection. There's nothing technical about that, by the way. So that's kind of interesting. Thank you, Nick. And in the other corner, I don't know why I'm putting you in corners, we have Lindsay Solorio, who is a principal and director of landscape architecture at Core Design. And nothing technical about this thing. I just know a little, what Lindsay does. I'm fascinated. I'm excited to hear from Lindsay. And Mike Lentz, who served as the Senior VP of Cloud Services at ServiceNow, and most recently as VP of Infrastructure at Shopify. So obviously Mike has no experience leading technical type people. So it's really unfortunate that we have two people that really have no relevant experience for this. What a group, you guys. And also know this, they became quick friends this morning. So as they launch into this, I'm just excited for this. As I told them, Nick, Lindsay, and Mike, so grateful you're here to share. I'm going to step out and let you all have your wild conversation. And know this also, everyone, Sabbath will jump back in and rudely interrupt them when it is time to stop and for us to all go crowdsource wisdom together. So I'm out, y'all. We're looking forward, but I'm still here. Have a great conversation.
All right. Well, let's kick off. All right. So I think Rob kicked off a little bit ago and talked about kind of some of these items in the article. We talked about 5, 7, I think 9 and 10. Lindsay, which one did you choose and why?
I did. I chose two because I couldn't narrow down to one. But the first one that stood out to me was that productivity will no longer be measured by work produced. And for me, before I came into a leadership role, like the nature of our business, so I'm a principal at a land development consulting company, and our work is measured in billable hours, that hours devoted to a project versus hours of overhead. And for years, one of the metrics of how much you're doing is how much your time is billable. And overnight, almost, my role went from being very technical and doing the work to managing the work and managing people. And the actual volume of work that I did probably dropped off by half within the first month. And that was a huge change that I knew was necessary, but also it was kind of uncomfortable and left me with a little bit of insecurity because I felt like all of a sudden I wasn't doing nearly what I had been doing before. And just the change in perspective of that my work is people now. Yeah. And being able to lend technical expertise when it's needed, but that's not the doing isn't it anymore. How about you both?
You found it, I would say, you found it hard to pull yourself back when you get brought into those technical pieces. Yeah. And that's one of the biggest things I run into is kind of that error trap of, oh, I'm comfortable here because I know this.
Yes.
I have to really, I'd like to say I have to pull myself back, but I've been pulled back by the collar by my supervisors more than once on that. So, or pushed out by my team.
Yeah. Also. No, that's fair. Yeah. I like what you brought up, Lindsay. Like for me, it was, you talked about the billable hours and getting people, but for me, it was around how work is getting produced. It was basically like the outcome was the most visible, but for me, like especially to build like at scale and repeatable processes and structures and thinking was like the how, and that was totally a people issue, right? A people project of like, hey, we have a bunch of technology. How are we going to deploy it and run it and operate it and scale it? Really had to come down to like, how am I leading people to think in a particular way and receiving feedback as a leader, like, hey, when we've gone astray, what did we learn from, and turn that back into a learning process. So yeah, definitely aligned with that.
What numbers stood out to both of you for points in the article?
Since Mike was just talking, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, go for it.
I was gonna say, since you were just talking process, that was the other one that jumped out to me because in the space I'm in with security, so much of it's process based, that processes serve people. That's a stark reminder that I think really gets overlooked a lot because we get so wedded to the process because it works that we need to make sure we step back and say, is it still working? Is it working for the people we have, or is it working for people we used to have? Is it working for the problems we have now?
Yeah.
It's continually challenging that.
Well, yeah, I think process gets a really bad name as well. Like in some cultures and some companies, process it's very frowned upon, right? Like, oh, it's so structured and process. But I think to your point, Nick, if we could take time and actually analyze those processes, does it meet our people? Does it meet our business today and where we're going? Probably more importantly, where we're going. That is what we want to go accomplish. And that's what we should focus on, because those processes help eliminate roadblocks and barriers and pitfalls. And gives us a level of consistency, but they can quickly get outdated.
Yeah. It's important to remember they evolve along with us in our organizations, or they should.
Yeah.
I'm curious for both of you, when you think about process, is process for you something that gets constant, regular updates, or do you feel that process is better at large milestones?
Yes.
I like that answer. I don't feel a process when things are moving along. I don't think I've had a hard time myself in getting my organization to review process, especially when it's working and you're moving forward. You're like, it's not on my radar because I'm usually dealing with problems or what's the next thing ahead of us to go accomplish. So I think there's a level of discipline that has to be put into your organization or even yourself as a leader, is like, hey, who is responsible? Because there are some folks that geek out on that stuff. So you got to find those passionate individuals who really want to like lean into the process and figure out what's working and what's not. How about you all?
I think
I'm not the person that leans into process.
I think if you set out to adjust a process, review a process, that's just weighty and overwhelming, and you're trying to eat the whole elephant all in one bite.
Yeah.
I think if you let it go naturally, and one of the tricks that I learned really early in my career before I was in the leadership side was kind of the principle of Napoleon's corporal. Take your person who probably knows the least about what's going on, have them look at it and see if it makes sense. So anytime we get somebody new to the team, say, hey, go tell me what's broken. What do we need to fix?
Yeah.
Bring that outsider perspective before you get assimilated into the process and just deal with it.
Yeah. You could also attack it, I think, in two other ways as well. I think similar to what you said, Lindsay, whether it's milestone based. Hey, at the end of the project, we do some type of retrospective. Hey, what worked, what didn't, or in an event, right? I've ran production systems my entire career. Things break, they go bump in the night, usually in the night, very early mornings. What do you do what do you learn from that, and what adjustments do you need to make so you can kind of do it in the moment, which is super helpful to keep them from too much atrophy. For me, on my list here was technical problems are people problems. And that's why even in the chat to kick off this conversation, it was really around like, are they the same? Because I think a lot of times they are the same, right? Being in a technical space, the technology decisions that you make, architectures, code, whatever it may be, whatever granularity you want to get to, there's a heavy influence of people into all of those decisions. And like I've led teams of 5 and I've led organizations of 1,100 people, and it's all the same. Like you just have to start to understand how all those pieces are moving together. And so, yeah, almost every technical problem we've ran into definitely had a human component to it.
I was interested in this topic and article because when I think about my own experience of moving from a technical role into a leadership position, I think about the fact that for most people, you spend years amassing knowledge and studying to learn the technical skills. And usually most people get very little runway moving into a leadership role. And suddenly you have to operate kind of shooting from the hip, and it's kind of weird and scary, and you don't always do things the right way. I certainly have learned from my failures over the years, but yeah, it's interesting because it's a totally different skill set.
Yeah.
That was one that jumped out to me is how do we make sure to remind ourselves to give ourselves grace while still challenging ourselves to learn this entirely new skill set, especially for some of us mid-career, a little more set in our ways than we were in our early 20s when we first started learning the technical side.
Yeah. It's hard. It's hard receiving that feedback, right? I think I found it much easier when I was younger because I was like new. Like Nick, you were saying in our intro this morning when we became friends very quickly, and you were just thrown into it at 22 or something like that. I led a team at 23. And I had people on my team that were like 45 years old. I'm like, what the heck am I doing? Like, I'm not qualified for this. And there's even times now when leading organizations, I'm like, I'm not qualified to do this. Yeah, so I think give yourself grace and be able to receive that feedback. But I think company culture and the people who you surround yourself with or are surrounded with have a lot to do with that as well, how receptive you are to that feedback, at least for me.
Yeah, I think it's funny now when I think about the people that I manage, their technical skills are way better than mine were at the peak of when I was producing. Like those folks, yeah, are no way more than I do.
So how do you approach that as a leader? Like, how are you good with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there's times that I genuinely have to ask for help, but I realize that something that is needed is out of my forte.
Yeah.
And there's that delegation piece and knowing that the priorities for my time are working with people. It would actually be a disservice to try to lean heavier into when I realize that I don't know something as well technically as the really smart folks that work for me, and that is okay.
That was one of those things I was glad that kind of, you mentioned where my leadership career started with the military. They teach you just enough to really kind of know enough that you're not a detriment to your crew. But your job is to lead. For me, it was to lead the entire platoon, not the tank. I had to learn enough on the tank to not get myself caught in the turret and squished, but that's about it. But it really kind of forced it. It is. It's helpful. But yeah, I forced that humility, which is also another thing that 22-year-old me really needed. To be humbled a bit and remember that.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting. Like domain expertise, when you're like a technical person or an individual contributor, you become a leader, right? That technical expertise gives you a lot of like street cred with the team or the organization, right? Because you can hold your own as you're balancing and learning this leadership side of yourself. But at some point that like it will, I found for myself that I went too far on the leadership side and I drifted away from the tech. So it's always like kind of this learn motion of like, oh, get deep dive. And I had a great mentor years ago. He talked about, I asked him like, hey, how do you, he was a chief operating officer. I'm like, how do you stay relevant? How do you know what's going on? And he had this very simple way. Is like, you got to scan and deep dive, scan your environment. If there's an area that doesn't look healthy or you just don't know about it, you should deep dive. That deep dive could be an hour, a day, a week. But he's like, you have to have a discipline as a leader to eject yourself back out after you've assessed what's going on and helped out and learned or corrected it. You have to eject yourself back out and then scan again. And I try to keep that in my mind as well as I move forward.
You mentioned that the street cred from the technical side, and it took me back to my second leadership stint, which is 23, 24. And the street cred I got by admitting I didn't know everything and asking, hey, you're the expert in this. I'm here to help keep the wheels on track and keep the trains running on time. What would you do? And to have people who hadn't had that leadership style before, that were truly collaborative, that got me so much street cred that I'm still very close with most of those guys that I served with at that point. And it set us up for a great working relationship for the couple of years we were together. It also set it up for when I had to make a decision, a command decision. They understood that it was because there were other things that I would include them in the decision making when possible, but they had to trust that there were times that wasn't going to be realistic. So kind of that balance of vulnerability versus kind of the duck on the pond is one of my last bosses, you should call it. She said I always looked like a duck on a pond. She goes, but I've seen under the hood enough to know that you are freaking out all the time. Welcome to corporate security. That's the entire world.
Yeah, I think with teams, it's so much better to acknowledge when you don't have the answer for something or ask for input than to try to just fake your way through it, because I feel like that it's so visible when it's disingenuous in that way.
Yeah.
There's a time and a place for fake it till you make it, but be prepared to get caught.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So the piece that jumped out to me in this one was that imposter syndrome is not all bad. So number 7, if you're reading through the article now, but that's something the last, I'd say like 6-7 months, I've started to try to embrace that as, okay, this is something somewhere, either subconsciously or somebody externally, something is telling me I need to course correct, or I need to check myself. Or my wife says I live somewhere in the pendulum between extreme arrogance and crippling imposter syndrome. And I can swing anywhere between the two all day long. So kind of look at that as the course correction piece for me. But how do I use that? I started thinking through that in the last couple of days since reading the article. Like, am I challenging my capacity or capability? Am I constraining myself with that imposter syndrome? Or am I getting a bit over my ski tips and pulling back a bit? So yeah. Any thoughts for you guys on that?
Imposter syndrome is real. I relate so much to that.
Yeah, it's absolutely real. I think Dr. Rob and I have had this conversation in one-on-one meetings about imposter syndrome, and it puts me in a place of fear, right? And like, I think the way you framed it, Rob, was like, it tells you you're exactly in an environment by which you can grow. And I think that little mindset shift of like, okay, I'm in a growth opportunity here. I've identified in some fashion, I've identified a gap or a weakness or a fear of mine, like, and really lean into that and try to discover what that looks like. But yeah, I mean, imposter syndrome, because you want to have all the answers. And I think, again, it comes back to the culture that you're in. There's some cultures that fully embrace a learning environment by which you can be wrong. You can explore and really like, kind of just invent as you go. And there's other cultures where that's not tolerated. And I've lived in both. And, I prefer the former versus the latter. But in either situation, if you're not feeling it, you just have to dig into the why. I think it's super helpful.
I think that experiencing a dose of that keeps you from sliding into just being comfortable when you're operating at a status quo. That little bit of discomfort is a good motivator.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But yeah, do either of you have any just overall thoughts about stepping into leadership?
For me, the piece that I started with, even before I read the article, was what made me want to be a leader. At the time, it was because I was told that's what I should aspire to.
Yeah.
I've learned later it's because it really is truly fulfilling for me.
Yeah.
But it was kind of thrust upon me. I think most of us can relate to that.
Yeah. I think at least in the tech industry, it's interesting. That was your only path for growth, right? You capped out at some technical individual contributor, and we're seeing now there's a big push to like, hey, you could be a vice president, senior vice president level individual contributor as like a principal or senior principal or something like that, which is fantastic. But for me, it was I think a little bit of that. The area is like, hey, if you want to grow, you became a leader. But I think it just felt natural. Like whether I was an individual contributor doing my thing, I had a high level of ownership and wanted to connect the dots. And so moving to leadership felt very natural to me.
I'm gonna be that little kid in the fishbowl. What we know about fishbowls is they're there for the kids to get their hands in on. Thank you, Mike, Nick, and Lindsay, for a rich conversation. Thank you for the vulnerability and the call for us to find humility in the spaces of leadership. There's so many things that we can take away from this conversation.